When I got married, I didn't mention that I'd inherited 3 estates from my grandmother. And thank God I kept quiet because just a week later, my wife's mother showed up with a notary. My name is Oliver Reed. And if there's one thing I've learned in my 33 years of stumbling through life, it's that I have an absolutely Olympic-level talent for ignoring red flags. Seriously, I could spot a software bug from 3 code reviews away, but put a warning sign the size of a billboard in my personal life, and I'll just wave at it like we're old friends and keep on walking. It's a gift, really, though not the kind anyone asks for on their birthday. When I married Clara Mitchell on that picture-perfect Saturday afternoon in June, I genuinely thought the universe had finally decided to cut me some slack. You know that feeling when you've been playing life on hard mode for so long that you forget easy mode even exists? Yeah, that was me. The wedding was small, intimate, the kind of thing you see in indie movies where everyone's wearing linen and nobody's drunk uncle gives a speech about his ex-wife. We had this gorgeous lake view venue with fairy lights strung up like somebody had lassoed the stars and brought them down just for us. The sunset was doing that golden hour thing that makes even the most basic iPhone photos look like they belong in National Geographic. And honestly, for about 4 hours, I felt like the luckiest bastard on the planet. My best man Logan, God bless him, cried harder than my bride did during the vows. I'm talking full-on ugly crying, the kind where you can't tell if someone's experiencing profound joy or having a legitimate medical emergency. He kept dabbing at his face with this tiny cocktail napkin that was absolutely not equipped for the waterworks he was producing, and at one point I genuinely considered calling a paramedic because I thought he might dehydrate. Clara looked beautiful in her dress, this elegant off-white thing that probably cost more than my first car, but looked worth every penny. Her hair was done up in some complicated situation that had taken 3 hours and involved more bobby pins than I knew existed in the world. When she walked down that makeshift aisle, everyone gasped like they were supposed to, and I thought, yeah, okay, this is it. This is the good part of life everyone keeps talking about. Everyone clapped at all the right moments. People threw biodegradable rose petals because apparently regular rose petals are now considered environmentally irresponsible, which is news to me, but whatever makes everyone feel better about their carbon footprint. Strangers and friends alike kept coming up to us during the reception, glasses of champagne in hand, telling us we were the perfect couple and asking when we'd start popping out perfect babies to complete the perfect picture. Clara ate it up like she'd been starving for this kind of validation her whole life, and honestly, I almost believed it myself. Almost. There's always that little voice in the back of your head, though, isn't there? That tiny skeptical narrator who sounds suspiciously like your grandmother telling you not to count your chickens before they hatch. Or in this case, not to count your happily ever after before the honeymoon phase wears off. But here's the thing nobody knew. The detail I'd been sitting on like it was a live grenade with a faulty pin. While Clara was busy tossing her bouquet to a crowd of increasingly desperate single women who looked like they were about to start throwing elbows, I was busy guarding a secret that would have changed everything. 6 months before I even proposed, before I picked out a ring that cost me 2 months' salary like some outdated tradition demanded, my grandmother Evelyn passed away and left me 3 fully paid estates in downtown Seattle. Not condos, not apartments, estates. The kind of property that makes real estate agents start breathing heavily and talking in hushed, reverent tones. We're talking prime Belltown real estate with views that make tech executives weep and parking spaces that cost more than most people's cars. Now, I can already hear you asking the obvious question. Why the hell didn't I tell my fiancée/wife about a multi-million-dollar inheritance? Why did I stand there in my rented tuxedo, saying, I do, while simultaneously sitting on enough wealth to make our wedding look like a clearance sale at Target? Was I insane? Paranoid? Suffering from some weird psychological condition where you can't share good news without breaking out in hives? The answer is simpler and more complicated than you'd think, and it all comes back to Grandma Evelyn, because of course it does. About a year before she died, we were sitting on her back porch drinking iced tea that was about 60% sugar and 40% actual tea, watching the neighbors argue about whose turn it was to mow the shared grass area. Out of absolutely nowhere, she turned to me with those sharp gray eyes that had seen more decades than I'd seen years and said, Oliver, if you ever fall in love, and I mean really fall in love, not that puppy dog nonsense you felt for that girl in college who stole your laptop. You keep your bank account out of it. She said it like she was giving me directions to the grocery store, just casual life-changing advice dropped between sips of diabetes juice. I remember laughing it off at the time, thinking she was being dramatic, maybe a little paranoid from watching too many true crime documentaries on cable. But then she fixed me with that look, the one that meant she was about to drop some serious wisdom that I'd better write down, and she said, "I'm serious, boy. Money doesn't change people. It just reveals who they've been all along. You want to know who someone really is? Keep your wallet closed and watch what happens." And let me tell you something about Grandma Evelyn. This was a woman who had survived the tail end of the Depression, 2 actual wars, one of which she served in as a nurse. Thank you very much. 3 separate recessions that would have made grown men cry, and 1 absolutely legendary bridge club feud that resulted in a permanent schism in the local community center, and allegedly 1 attempted poisoning via suspiciously over-salted lemon bars. The woman had seen some stuff. She'd lived through historical events that were now chapters in textbooks. She'd buried a husband, raised a son, buried that son and his wife after their car accident, and then raised me from age 8 with nothing but grit, tough love, and an encyclopedic knowledge of compound interest. So when Evelyn Reed gave advice, I didn't just listen. I took notes, highlighted the important parts, and filed it away in the mental folder labeled stuff that will probably save my life someday. Her wisdom wasn't the kind you found in Instagram quote graphics or self-help books written by people whose biggest struggle was choosing between yachts. This was earned wisdom, the kind that came from actually living and paying attention and not being an idiot about the important stuff. That's why, when her lawyer, this ancient guy named Theodore who looked like he'd written the original Constitution, called me into his wood-paneled office that smelled like old books and expensive leather, and told me I'd inherited 3 luxury apartments, her suburban home, and an investment portfolio that made my eyes water, I nearly fainted right there on his Persian rug. I remember just sitting there, gripping the arms of this stupidly uncomfortable chair, whispering, "She was rich?" Like I'd just discovered my grandmother was actually a secret agent or a wizard or something equally impossible. Theodore looked at me over his half-moon glasses with something between pity and amusement and said, "Very. In that way fancy lawyers do when they're trying not to say you sweet, oblivious idiot. The thing is, Grandma Evelyn never acted rich. She clipped coupons. She bought store-brand cereal. She drove a 1998 Honda Civic that had more miles on it than a mid-tier spaceship and made sounds that could only be described as concerning. She wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation and thought spending more than $20 on dinner was getting fancy. I had no idea. None. The woman was sitting on enough wealth to retire a small army of people, and she lived like someone who was perpetually 1 bad month away from eating ramen for every meal. But that was Evelyn. She didn't trust flash, didn't trust show, didn't trust anyone who measured worth by what you owned instead of who you were. And she definitely didn't trust anyone who'd love you more after seeing your bank statement than before. So when I walked out of Theodore's office with documents that basically made me a millionaire, her voice was right there in my head, clear as day. Keep your bank account out of it. I decided right then and there to stay quiet about the inheritance. I'd tell Clara eventually, obviously. I'm not a complete psychopath, but I figured I'd wait until we'd been married a while, until we'd built something real that wasn't standing on a foundation of dollar signs and property values. I thought, if this love is real, if it's the actual deal and not just some romantic comedy we're acting out because society says this is what you do in your 30s, then it shouldn't need a property list and a net worth statement to survive. Love should be about the person, right? Not the portfolio. Looking back now, sitting in one of those inherited estates with a glass of wine and the kind of hindsight that makes you want to build a time machine just so you can go back and slap yourself, I can see how perfectly, painfully naive that was. But at the time, standing there at my own wedding, watching Clara laugh with her bridesmaids and Logan finally getting his crying under control, I genuinely believed I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being smart, protecting something precious, following the wisdom of a woman who'd never steered me wrong. Spoiler alert, Grandma Evelyn was right. Again, she was always right. It's honestly kind of annoying how right she always was, but that's dead grandmothers for you. They haunt you with their correctness. Growing up with Grandma Evelyn was like being raised by a combination of a drill sergeant, a financial advisor, and occasionally, when she was in a really good mood, a human being capable of affection. She wasn't the cookie-baking, cheek-pinching type of grandmother you see in Hallmark movies or those weirdly perfect stock photos that come in picture frames. No, Evelyn Reed was all business, tough love, and an almost supernatural ability to turn any life situation into a teachable moment about fiscal responsibility. I'm pretty sure if I'd broken my arm as a kid, she would have handed me an ice pack and a pamphlet about the importance of emergency savings accounts before even considering a trip to the hospital. After my parents died in that car accident when I was 8, a drunk driver, a rainy Tuesday night, and the kind of phone call that splits your life into a before and after that never quite lines up right again, Grandma Evelyn took me in without hesitation. I remember that night with the kind of clarity that trauma gives you, all sharp edges and two bright colors. One minute I was at a friend's house having a sleepover, arguing about which Power Ranger was the coolest, and the next minute Grandma was there in the doorway looking older than I'd ever seen her, telling me in this voice that didn't shake even once that my mom and dad weren't coming home. Ever. She didn't sugarcoat it, didn't promise me everything would be okay, didn't do any of that gentle parenting stuff that was probably already a thing back then, but definitely wasn't Evelyn's style. She just said, "You're going to live with me now, Oliver, and we're going to get through this because that's what Reeds do. We get through things." And we did get through it, though get through it, in Evelyn's world meant a pretty strict regimen of emotional compartmentalization and what I now recognize as possibly the most intense financial education any kid has ever received outside of a child prodigy convention. While other kids were learning their multiplication tables, I was learning the difference between a Roth IRA and a traditional IRA. While my friends were getting allowances for doing chores, I was getting lectures about the importance of compound interest and why saving 20% of any money I received was non-negotiable, young man, unless you want to end up eating cat food in your retirement. I was 12. I wasn't even thinking about retirement. I was thinking about whether Jennifer Martinez in my homeroom knew I existed and if I'd ever be cool enough to sit at the good lunch table. But Grandma Evelyn had her 3 commandments, her holy trinity of life rules that she repeated so often I could recite them in my sleep. Probably did recite them in my sleep, if we're being honest. They were posted on the refrigerator on a piece of yellow legal paper in her precise, no-nonsense handwriting that looked like it could cut glass. Rule number 1. Never lend money to someone who says, "I'll pay you back next Friday." According to Evelyn, next Friday was a mystical time period that existed in the same realm as someday, eventually, and when I get my life together. It never actually arrived. It was always next Friday, perpetually out of reach, like some kind of financial Groundhog Day where Friday never comes and your money definitely never comes back. I learned this lesson the hard way in high school when my buddy Marcus asked to borrow $40 for just until Friday. I swear, man, my paycheck's coming. That was in October. I'm 33 now. I'm still waiting for that Friday, Marcus. Rule number 2 was slightly more cryptic, but somehow even more serious in Evelyn's eyes. Never buy anything that glows and talks after midnight. Now, this one sounds insane, and honestly it kind of is, but her reasoning was actually pretty solid if you looked past the weird phrasing. She meant don't make impulse purchases when you're tired, drunk, emotional, or otherwise compromised in your decision-making abilities. The glows and talks part was her way of describing late-night infomercial products, shopping network garbage, or anything marketed by someone who was way too enthusiastic about a vegetable slicer or a blanket with sleeves. She told me once about this time in the 70s when she'd had 3 glasses of wine, which for Evelyn was basically a bender, and bought some kind of exercise machine off the TV that promised to give her the body of a 20-year-old in just 20 minutes a day. The thing arrived 6 weeks later, took 4 hours to assemble, looked like a medieval torture device, and she used it exactly twice before it became a very expensive clothing rack. She never forgave herself for that purchase. Literally never. She brought it up at least once a month as an example of financial irresponsibility and the dangers of mixing alcohol with consumer access to credit cards. But rule number 3. Oh man, rule number 3 was the big one. The commandment that sat at the top of the pyramid, the one she'd get this intense look about when she said it. Never, ever tell people how much money you have, especially someone who calls you babe. She'd emphasize that last part with this knowing look, like she'd seen some stuff in her time that would make a soap opera look tame. And knowing Evelyn's history, She probably had. The woman had been widowed at 52 when my grandfather died, and apparently in the years after, she'd had her share of gentlemen callers who were very interested in her company and possibly even more interested in the fact that she owned her house outright and had what she called a comfortable nest egg. She told me about this one guy, Bernard, who she'd dated for about 3 months. Real smooth talker, always dressed nice, said all the right things, called her babe and sweetness and other terms of endearment that should have been red flags but somehow weren't at first. Then one day he started asking questions about her finances, real casual-like, just slipping them into conversation like he was asking about the weather. "So, babe, you own this place outright? No mortgage? That's impressive. Hey, sweetness, what bank do you use? I'm thinking of switching." It escalated until he finally suggested she might want to add him to her bank accounts for convenience, since they were getting so serious. That's when Evelyn, being Evelyn, told him to get the hell out of her house and never come back. Except she probably used more colorful language than that, because Grandma could swear like a sailor when properly motivated. The point was, she'd learned the hard way that money changes how people see you, or maybe it just reveals how they'd been seeing you all along, like those magic eye pictures from the 90s where you had to stare at it just right to see the hidden image. And once people knew you had money, really had it, not just getting by comfortably money, but could retire tomorrow and buy a boat, money, they started treating you differently. They started calculating. They started seeing you as a resource instead of a person, an opportunity instead of a relationship, a potential solution to all their financial problems instead of just your regular old self. So when Theodore, the ancient lawyer, I swear this guy had probably handled legal affairs for Abraham Lincoln, called me into his office about 6 months before I proposed to Clara, I thought it was going to be some standard estate business, maybe signing some papers about Grandma's house or dealing with her final affairs. She'd passed away 3 weeks earlier, quiet and quick from a heart attack in her sleep, which honestly was exactly how she would have wanted to go. No fuss, no prolonged illness, no chance for anyone to see her vulnerable. Just here one day, gone the next, probably arguing with St. Peter about the entry fees to heaven being fiscally irresponsible. Theodore's office looked like it hadn't been redecorated since roughly the Civil War. Everything was dark wood and leather, with law books lining the walls that probably hadn't been opened since people still wrote with quill pens. He had me sit in this chair that was clearly designed to be uncomfortable on purpose, probably to keep clients from staying too long and running up billable hours. Then he opened this thick folder with Evelyn's name on it and started reading in that dry, legal voice that makes everything sound like a terms and conditions agreement nobody actually reads. "Mrs. Reed's estate consists of the following assets," he began, and then proceeded to list things that made my brain short-circuit like a laptop that just had an entire soda spilled on it. 3 luxury apartments in downtown Seattle, currently rented out and generating something called substantial monthly income. Her house in the suburbs where I'd grown up, fully paid off, probably worth $500,000 easy in the current market. And then, there was the investment portfolio. Stocks, bonds, mutual funds, retirement accounts. Apparently, while I was growing up thinking we were solidly middle class and clipping coupons was just what responsible people did, Grandma had been quietly building a financial empire that would make a hedge fund manager nod with respect. "The total estimated value," Theodore said, looking at me over those ridiculous half-moon glasses that only lawyers and stereotypical librarians wear, "is approximately $4.2 million, give or take, depending on market fluctuations." I just sat there. I don't remember breathing. I might have actually stopped breathing. My vision got kind of tunnel-wide, and I thought I might pass out right there on his antique rug that probably cost more than my car. She was rich. I finally managed to whisper, and even to my own ears I sounded like a child who just found out Santa Claus is real after being told he wasn't. Theodore almost smiled, this tiny crack in his professional facade. "Very," he said, like he was confirming that yes, water is indeed wet, and the sky is in fact blue. The thing that got me, the thing that still gets me when I think about it now, is that Grandma Evelyn never acted like someone with money. She lived in that same modest house for 40 years. She drove that embarrassing Honda until it literally couldn't be driven anymore. She bought store-brand everything, got excited about senior discount days at the grocery store, and once lectured me for 20 minutes about leaving lights on in empty rooms because electricity isn't free, Oliver, and neither is the planet we're destroying with our wasteful habits. The woman was sitting on over $4 million, and she was reusing Ziploc bags. But I got it eventually. She wasn't being cheap. She was being smart. She was being invisible. She'd learned that lesson about money and people the hard way, probably multiple times, and she'd decided that living below your means wasn't just financially responsible. It was protective. It kept the Bernard types away. It kept people honest. It meant that anyone who loved her for who she was, not what she had. And right there, sitting in Theodore's office, I decided to honor that lesson. I'd keep quiet about the inheritance. Not forever, but long enough to know that when I told Clara, it wouldn't change anything because we'd have already built something real. Clara Mitchell was, on paper and in practice, pretty much everything you'd want in a partner if you were making a checklist like some kind of romantic psychopath. She was beautiful in that effortless way that made other women ask what her skincare routine was and made guys walk into lampposts because they weren't paying attention to where they were going. She had this laugh that could stop traffic, literally. I once saw a guy in a BMW nearly rear-end a taxi because he was too busy turning around to see where that sound was coming from. She was smart, funny in a self-deprecating way that didn't feel forced, and she had this energy about her that made even grocery shopping feel like an adventure. We'd met at a tech conference of all places, bonded over our mutual hatred of networking events and overpriced conference coffee. And somehow 6 months later, I was thinking about engagement rings and looking up the current market rate for diamonds like I was researching a stock investment. But then I met her family, and suddenly a lot of things started making way more sense. Like when you're watching a movie and the plot twist happens and you realize all those weird little details from earlier were actually foreshadowing. Margaret and Henry Turner were, to put it diplomatically, a lot. To put it less diplomatically, they were the kind of people who make you understand why some species eat their young. Henry Turner owned a car dealership, Turner Premium Autos, because of course it was called that. And he had clearly missed the memo that owning a car dealership in the suburbs doesn't actually make you royalty. The man wore more cologne than a teenage boy going to his first dance, drove a different luxury car every week like he was test driving his own personality, and had this handshake that was way too firm, like he was trying to assert dominance through carpal tunnel syndrome. The first time I met him, Clara and I had been dating for about 3 months, and she'd finally decided I was ready to be presented to the family like some kind of sacrificial offering. We drove up to their house, and I'm using the word house loosely here because this thing was basically a small mansion pretending to be humble. In my totally reasonable Toyota Camry that I'd bought used because I'm not an idiot and cars depreciate the second you drive them off the lot. I parked next to Henry's current vehicle of choice, some kind of Mercedes that probably cost more than most people make in a year, and I already felt like I was losing a game I didn't know I was playing. Henry opened the door before we even knocked, like he'd been watching through the window, and immediately went for the power handshake while giving my Camry a look that suggested I'd arrived on a donkey. "So, Oliver," he said, still crushing my hand like we were in some kind of masculine grip strength competition. "What's your annual income, son? Not nice to meet you. Not welcome to our home. Not even how's the weather. Just straight to the financial interrogation." I hadn't even crossed the threshold. My foot was literally still on the welcome mat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Clara made this embarrassed squeaking noise and said, "Dad, oh my God." But Henry just laughed this booming laugh like he'd made a hilarious joke, instead of committing a social faux pas that would make Emily Post rise from her grave to file a complaint. Margaret Turner appeared from somewhere deeper in the house, and I swear she materialized like a ghost in a Victorian novel, all flowing fabrics, and the kind of perfume that arrives 5 minutes before she does and lingers for an hour after she leaves. She was dripping in pearls, and I mean dripping, like someone had told her pearls were going out of style tomorrow, and she needed to wear her entire collection at once. She looked me up and down with the kind of assessment usually reserved for livestock auctions or job interviews at companies that definitely have HR violations waiting to happen, and then she smiled this smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Oh, you rent? That's..." And then she paused for what felt like 17 years before finishing with, "Adorable. Adorable." She called my living situation adorable. Like I was a puppy who'd made a mess on the carpet, but was too cute to stay mad at. I wanted to point out that renting was actually a financially sound decision in a volatile real estate market and gave me flexibility and liquidity that homeownership didn't. But Clara was giving me this pleading look that said, please don't engage. I have to live with these people's opinions for the rest of my life. So I just smiled and said something bland about how we were keeping our options open. Dinner was like being interrogated by the world's most passive-aggressive police department, except instead of good cop/bad cop, it was rich cop/richer cop. Every single topic, and I mean every single one, somehow circled back to money like we were all stuck in some kind of financial gravitational pull. Margaret asked what I did for work, and when I said software engineer, Henry immediately wanted to know if I worked for one of the big tech companies. And when I said no, I worked for a mid-sized firm that did boring but stable corporate contracts. I could literally see the disappointment settle over the table like fog. Margaret asked where I grew up, and when I mentioned the suburbs, she wanted to know if my parents still lived there. And when I said they'd passed away when I was young, there was this brief moment of what might have been sympathy before she asked, and did they leave you the house? Like my orphan status was primarily interesting from a real estate inheritance perspective. Then there was Ethan. Oh, Ethan. Clara's younger brother, 27 years old, and living proof that some people can coast through life on their parents' money and the vague promise of potential. He slouched into the dining room about 20 minutes late wearing a designer hoodie that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe, gave everyone a lazy wave, and immediately started talking about his business ideas in that way that made it very clear he'd never actually executed a single one. Throughout dinner, while Margaret and Henry were busy grilling me about my financial prospects like I was applying for a loan, Ethan kept interjecting with thoughts about cryptocurrency and how he was this close to launching a startup that would disrupt the industry, though he never specified which industry or what exactly he was disrupting or, any actual details that would suggest this was a real thing and not just something he said to justify living in his parents' basement and treating their credit cards like a public utility. The thing about entrepreneurship, Ethan said at one point, gesturing with his fork in a way that made me concerned for everyone's safety, is that it's about mindset. You have to think like a CEO even before you have a company. I nodded along because what else do you do in that situation? But internally, I was thinking that maybe step one of thinking like a CEO would be moving out of your parents' house and paying for your own phone bill. But what do I know? I'm just a guy with a regular job and a rental apartment that's apparently adorable. The Turner family motto, if they'd been honest enough to print it on a crest and hang it over their fireplace, would have been something like, if it doesn't sparkle, it doesn't matter, or maybe, net worth equals self-worth, or possibly just money in big gold letters. Every story Henry told somehow worked in how much something cost. Margaret couldn't mention a friend without including what their husband did for a living and where they vacationed. Even the food had price tags attached. This wine is from our private collection, $45 a bottle, and these truffles were flown in special. You know how expensive that is. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I was starting to develop what I can only describe as financial anxiety by proxy, like I was absorbing their materialism through osmosis, and it was making me physically uncomfortable. At one point, Margaret leaned over and patted my hand in this way that was probably meant to be maternal, but felt more like a queen acknowledging a peasant. And she said, Oliver, it's so refreshing to meet someone so grounded. Clara has dated boys, men, who were all flash and no substance. You're very real. The way she said real made it sound like a polite substitute for poor, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing or screaming or doing both at the same time. If she only knew. If any of them knew that I was sitting on enough real estate to make their precious house look like a starter home. But Grandma Evelyn's voice was right there in my head, clear as a bell. Never tell people how much money you have. The evening finally ended after what felt like 47 hours, but was probably only 3. Clara apologized the entire drive home, saying things like, they're not usually that intense, and I think they were just nervous meeting you, and other reassuring lies that we both knew weren't true. Her parents were exactly that intense. They were always that intense. This was their normal setting. They probably interrogated the mailman about his retirement portfolio and judged the grocery store cashier for not having dental insurance. I kissed Clara goodnight and told her it was fine, totally fine. All families are weird in their own way, and I could handle it. And I meant it, sort of. I could handle awkward family dinners and invasive questions, and the subtle implication that I wasn't quite good enough for their daughter. What I didn't realize yet, what I couldn't have known sitting in my car watching Clara walk into her apartment building, was that handling it and surviving it were two very different things. The Turners weren't just socially awkward rich people with boundary issues. They were calculators dressed in designer clothes, and I had just been sized up, assessed, and apparently found wanting. The scary part wasn't that they cared about money. Lots of people care about money. The scary part was that they seemed to care about money more than they cared about anything else, including possibly their own daughter's happiness. And that, as I would learn in increasingly uncomfortable detail, was a problem that couldn't be solved with good intentions and patience. When Clara and I got engaged, I proposed at this little Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. Very traditional, very safe. The kind of proposal that wouldn't make it onto any viral YouTube compilations, but also wouldn't end up on a worst proposals ever Reddit thread. I thought the hard part was over. I'd picked out a ring that cost enough to make my bank account weep, but not so much that I'd need to take out a loan. I'd done the whole down on one knee thing without falling over or dropping the ring down a sewer grate, or any of the other catastrophic scenarios I'd anxiety spiraled about for weeks. Clara said yes. People at nearby tables applauded like they'd been waiting for this moment their entire lives. The waiter brought us complimentary champagne that was probably just their house wine with bubbles, but tasted like victory. Everything was perfect, or at least as perfect as real life gets, which is to say slightly imperfect, but in manageable ways. Then Margaret Turner found out we were engaged, and suddenly I understood what people meant when they said, all hell broke loose. I swear to God, the woman must have had some kind of engagement alert system installed, because Clara barely had time to post the obligatory ring photo on Instagram before her mother was calling with what she described as ideas, but what were actually detailed military-style plans for a wedding that would have made royal families say maybe tone it down a bit. Margaret had apparently been planning her daughter's wedding since Clara was approximately 5 years old, which is either really sweet or deeply concerning depending on how you look at it, and she had binders. Multiple binders. Color-coded binders. Binders that probably had binders. I wanted a quiet ceremony with close friends and family. The kind of wedding where you actually remember people's names and can have real conversations instead of just doing a receiving line for 4 hours while your face hurts from fake smiling at your third cousin twice removed. Clara, to her credit, seemed to want something similar. She'd always been more low-key than her family, which was probably a survival mechanism developed over years of living with people who thought, understated, was a dirty word. But Margaret had other plans. Big plans. Elaborate plans. Plans that required a production budget that could have funded a small independent film. I'm thinking we do it at the country club, Margaret announced during what was supposed to be a casual brunch to discuss options, but was actually a presentation she'd probably rehearsed in the mirror. She had a slideshow. An actual slideshow on her iPad with photos of previous weddings held at their country club, which apparently had a special events coordinator and a wedding package that started at a price that made me choke on my overpriced Eggs Benedict. We can easily accommodate 300 guests, and the grounds are perfect for photos. I'm seeing white roses, lots of white roses, maybe some orchids flown in from 300 people. I interrupted, probably more forcefully than I should have. I don't even know 300 people. I'm not sure I've met 300 people in my entire life if we're not counting, like, cashiers and people on the subway. Margaret waved this away like I'd made a joke. Oh, Oliver, don't be silly. Between our family friends, business associates, my book club, Henry's golf buddies, the people from our church, our neighbors, it adds up quickly. You'd be surprised. I'm already surprised, I muttered, but she was already moving on to the next slide, which showed something that looked less like a wedding decoration and more like someone had bedazzled an entire building. She wanted a drone show. An actual drone show with coordinated lights spelling out our names in the sky, because apparently fireworks were too pedestrian and she'd seen something similar at a wedding in the Hamptons, and everyone was talking about it for months. Clara shot me a look across the table that was half apologetic, half pleading, and I realized we were entering negotiation territory. This wasn't going to be a simple, thanks for the input, Margaret, but we've got this handled situation. This was going to require diplomatic skills I definitely didn't possess and patience I wasn't sure I had. Over the next several weeks, Wedding planning became less like planning a celebration of love and more like preparing for some kind of elaborate corporate merger where both parties were trying to maintain control while pretending to compromise. Margaret wanted a swan fountain. I still don't know what a swan fountain is or why anyone would want one, but apparently they're a thing at fancy weddings, and she'd already contacted a company that specialized in aquatic bird centerpieces. I vetoed the swan fountain. She pouted for 3 days and sent Clara passive-aggressive text messages about not feeling included in her daughter's special day. I wanted to serve normal wedding food. You know, chicken, fish, maybe a vegetarian option for Clara's cousin who'd recently become insufferable about her diet. Margaret wanted a 7-course meal prepared by a chef who'd appeared on some cooking competition show and charged more per plate than I spent on groceries in a month. People will judge you based on the food, Margaret insisted during one particularly tense planning session that took place in her living room, which was decorated like a museum had exploded and nobody had cleaned it up yet. A wedding is a reflection of the couple. You want people to remember this day. I want people to remember we got married, I said, trying to keep my voice level. Not that they got a Michelin star dining experience. We're not running a restaurant, Margaret. We're taking vows. She looked at me like I'd just suggested we get married at a McDonald's drive-thru. Oliver, dear, you clearly don't understand how these things work. And you know what? She was right. I didn't understand how these things worked in her world, where the price tag was more important than the actual event, where appearances mattered more than actual happiness, where you measured success by how jealous you made other people instead of how much joy you felt. But I was learning. Oh boy, was I learning. The violin player from Italy was Margaret's hill to die on, apparently. She'd somehow gotten it into her head that having an internationally recognized violinist perform during the ceremony would be sophisticated and memorable and worth the absolutely insane amount of money she was quoting. Never mind that nobody except maybe 3 people at the wedding would even know the difference between an Italian virtuoso and the local music teacher who plays at weddings on weekends. It was about the story, Margaret explained. It was about being able to say, "Oh, we flew him in from Milan. It was nothing really, but Clara deserved the best." We went back and forth on everything. The flowers. Margaret wanted rare imported blooms. I suggested we could achieve the same effect with local flowers that didn't require their own passport. The invitations. She wanted hand calligraph cards on paper, so thick you could use them as body armor. I suggested maybe we could just do nice printed ones that didn't cost more than some people's car payments. The photographer. She had already contacted someone who apparently shot celebrity weddings and charged accordingly. I'd found a perfectly good local photographer whose portfolio was beautiful and who didn't require a payment plan. Every single decision became a battle, and poor Clara was caught in the middle, trying to keep everyone happy and slowly realizing that keeping everyone happy was literally impossible when the two sides had completely different definitions of what happy even meant. I watched her get more stressed as the weeks went on, saw the joy of being engaged slowly drain out of her under the weight of her mother's expectations and her own inability to say no to the woman who'd raised her. Finally, after about 6 weeks of this nightmare that wedding planning had become, we reached what could generously be called a compromise and what I would call a mutual exhaustion agreement. We'd do the lake venue. Beautiful, smaller capacity, naturally gorgeous without requiring $40,000 in decorations. Margaret could have her fancy catering, but we'd scale it back to a reasonable menu that wouldn't require guests to attend a pre-wedding seminar on which fork to use. No swan fountain, but she could pick the flowers. No drone show, but we'd have nice string lights that would photograph well and wouldn't require filing flight plans with the FAA. The only reason we settled on the lake venue with those specific terms was because, and this is the kicker, Margaret couldn't find matching swans on short notice. That's literally the only reason. Not because she realized she was being ridiculous. Not because she had a moment of self-awareness about trying to turn her daughter's wedding into a competitive sport. But because the Swan Fountain Company was apparently booked solid and couldn't guarantee a breeding pair of white swans that were aesthetically consistent for our date. I'm not making this up. This is a real thing that happened in my real life. The wedding day itself, when it finally arrived after months of planning that had aged me approximately 7 years, was actually beautiful. The lake venue was perfect, the weather cooperated, and for a few hours, I forgot about all the stress and drama and just focused on the fact that I was marrying someone I loved. But then Henry gave his father of the bride speech, and I was reminded very quickly that I hadn't married just Clara. I'd married into a family that viewed everything, including marriage, as some kind of financial transaction. "Welcome to the Turner family, Oliver," Henry said, raising his champagne glass while at least 200 people watched and waited for the heartwarming moment that traditionally comes during these speeches. "May this union bring shared assets and long-term growth." Shared assets. Long-term growth. The man literally used business terminology in a wedding toast. People laughed because they thought he was joking, being clever, making some kind of dad joke about his daughter getting married. But I saw his face, saw that he was completely serious, saw Margaret nodding along like he'd just quoted Shakespeare instead of talking about marriage like it was a merger and acquisition. I clapped anyway, not because I agreed or because I thought it was sweet or funny or appropriate. I clapped because I was genuinely afraid that if I didn't, Henry might pull out an actual contract and ask me to sign something right there at the reception, possibly in front of all those witnesses to make it legally binding. If I had known that getting married meant acquiring Margaret Turner as a permanent fixture in my life with unlimited visiting privileges, I might have considered a longer engagement. Or possibly witness protection. The honeymoon was great. We went to Costa Rica, stayed in a little eco-lodge where the Wi-Fi barely worked and Margaret's phone calls couldn't reach us through the combination of spotty cell service and me accidentally letting Clara's phone die and forgetting the charger in a different part of the resort. For one glorious week, it was just us, some monkeys, a lot of tropical drinks, and zero conversations about real estate investments or the importance of building equity. But then we came home to our modest 2-bedroom apartment in a perfectly nice neighborhood that had the audacity to not be a mansion, and Margaret descended upon us like a well-dressed locust with opinions about our interior decorating choices. I'm talking about exactly 1 week after we got back. 7 days. We'd barely unpacked our suitcases, hadn't even finished the leftover wedding cake Clara's mom had insisted we take home, and that was now taking up half our freezer. I was still finding sand in places sand had no business being, and there was Margaret, standing at our door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and her arms full of stuff we definitely didn't ask for. "I was just in the neighborhood," she said, which was a lie because we lived 25 minutes from her house, and there was literally nothing in our neighborhood she'd have any reason to visit unless she'd suddenly developed a passionate interest in the slightly sketchy convenience store on the corner or the laundromat that always smelled like someone was boiling sadness. "I thought I'd pop by and see how the lovebirds are nesting." She said this like it was adorable and not deeply invasive, like she was narrating a nature documentary about our lives without our permission. She pushed past me before I could even properly register that this was happening, already doing that thing where she looked around our apartment with an expression that somehow combined concern, pity, and barely concealed judgment. Our apartment was fine. It was clean, relatively organized for 2 people who'd just gotten back from vacation, decorated in what I'd call functional adult style, which is to say we had furniture that matched well enough and art on the walls that came from actual stores, and not just random posters we'd tacked up with pushpins. But watching Margaret's face, you'd think we were living in a cardboard box under an overpass. "Oh," she said, and that one word contained volumes of disappointment. "This is cozy." Cozy. The kiss of death when it comes to real estate descriptions. Cozy means small. Cozy means your mother-in-law thinks you're living in a shoebox. Cozy means she's about to have opinions about your life choices, and those opinions are going to be delivered with surgical precision wrapped in fake concern. She set down the bag she'd brought. Expensive scented candles from some boutique store where candles cost more than groceries. A throw blanket that was probably cashmere or made from the wool of some rare Himalayan goat, and a set of wine glasses that looked like they required their own insurance policy. "Just a few things to help make this place feel more like a home," she said sweetly, which translated to "your current belongings are inadequate, and I'm here to fix that." Clara came out of the bedroom, saw her mother standing in our living room, and I watched this complex series of emotions cross her face: surprise, resignation, slight panic, and what I'm pretty sure was the look of someone who'd just realized this was going to be her life now. "Mom, I didn't know you were coming over." "It's fine, I won't stay long," Margaret said, which was also a lie because she proceeded to stay for 2.5 hours. She immediately launched into what I can only describe as a performance review of our living situation. She commented on everything. The furniture was charming, but we should really think about upgrading to something more substantial. The kitchen was adequate, but so small. How did we manage to cook in there? The view was nice enough, but wouldn't we prefer something with more natural light? Maybe a balcony, something with a bit more presence? And then came the line that made my eye twitch involuntarily. Margaret sat down on our couch, her couch now, apparently, since she'd mentally redecorated everything in the place, and said with this conspiratorial tone like she was about to share classified information, "You should really think about buying a house soon, Oliver. It's embarrassing for Clara to live in a rental." Embarrassing. She called our living situation embarrassing. Like Clara was some kind of damsel in distress being held captive in the terrible prison of affordable housing. Never mind that renting made perfect sense for us at this stage of our lives. Never mind that we had flexibility, weren't tied down to a mortgage, didn't have to worry about property taxes or fixing the water heater when it inevitably broke. Never mind that homeownership is a huge financial commitment that shouldn't be rushed into just because your mother-in-law thinks renting is somehow shameful. None of that mattered to Margaret. What mattered was appearances, and apparently, we were failing at those. "We're happy here," I said, trying to keep my voice even and polite, channeling every ounce of patience I'd learned from dealing with difficult clients who wanted me to completely rebuild their website but didn't want to pay for it. "We're saving up and looking at our options." Margaret made this little humming noise that was somehow both dismissive and condescending. "Of course, dear. I'm sure you're doing your best." Doing my best. Like I was a child who tried really hard on a math test but still failed. It's just that Clara is used to a certain standard of living, you know. Growing up in our home, she had space, privacy, nice things. I just want to make sure she's not sacrificing too much. The implication hung in the air like a bad smell. Clara was sacrificing by being with me. Clara was suffering in our perfectly nice apartment because I wasn't providing the lifestyle her mother thought she deserved. Never mind that Clara had never once complained, had actually said multiple times that she loved our place because it was ours and we'd built it together. Margaret had decided that her daughter was a victim of my financial inadequacy, and she was here to make sure I knew it. This became a pattern. Margaret started popping by with alarming frequency, each visit bringing more unsolicited gifts and even more unsolicited opinions. She brought kitchen gadgets we didn't need and commented on how small our kitchen was. She brought decorative pillows and mentioned how much more elegant they'd look in a larger living space. She brought actual paint swatches one time and suggested colors that would open up the space, which is decorator speak for, "Your walls are wrong, and I'm judging you." But the worst part wasn't the visits themselves. It was the interrogation that accompanied each one. Margaret had somehow decided that her mission in life was to conduct a complete audit of my financial situation, and she approached this task with the dedication of an IRS agent who'd just discovered a promising tax fraud case. The questions started casual enough, slipped into conversation like she was just making small talk, but they got progressively more invasive with each visit. "So, Oliver, how's work going? Are you up for any promotions soon?" Translation: Are you making more money yet? Have you thought about looking into investment opportunities? Henry and I have some real estate ventures that have done very well. Translation: Let me see your portfolio. What kind of retirement planning do you have? It's never too early to think about the future. Translation: Show me your 401k statement. Did your parents leave you anything when they passed? Any property or savings? And there it was. The question she'd been building up to, delivered with fake sympathy about my orphan status, but really just fishing for information about potential inheritance. I deflected, said something vague about how my grandmother had taken care of me and I was doing fine. Thanks for asking. But I could see the wheels turning in Margaret's head, calculating, assessing, trying to figure out if I had hidden assets she didn't know about. Each visit came with this side serving of financial interrogation disguised as motherly concern. She'd bring Clara fancy coffee from that overpriced place downtown and then casually ask about our savings account. She'd compliment my shirt and then mention how Henry's tailor could probably help me build a more professional wardrobe if money was tight. Which, for the record, it wasn't. I just preferred not to spend $300 on a button-up shirt when I could get a perfectly good one for $30. She'd admire our car. Well, my car, since Clara drove a newer model that her parents had bought her for her birthday, because of course they had, and then launch into a speech about the importance of reliable transportation and had we thought about upgrading to something more suitable for a married couple. Maybe something that said successful professional instead of college student who got lucky. I started to dread the sound of our doorbell. Every time it rang, I'd tense up, wondering if it was Margaret with another care package full of expensive things and expensive judgment. Clara would get this apologetic look on her face and mouth, "I'm sorry," before going to answer the door, and I'd brace myself for another 2 hours of passive-aggressive commentary about our life choices. The really insidious part was how Margaret framed everything as concern. She wasn't being nosy, she was being caring. She wasn't being invasive, she was being involved. She wasn't judging us, she was just looking out for her daughter's best interests. It was gaslighting wrapped in Chanel perfume and delivered with a smile that could cut glass. And the worst part was that Clara couldn't see it. Or maybe she could, but had been conditioned her whole life to accept this as normal maternal behavior. "She means well," Clara would say after Margaret finally left, usually after dropping some comment about how we should really consider buying property before we were too old to get a good mortgage rate. "She just wants us to be happy." But I was starting to realize that Margaret's definition of happy was actually wealthy and willing to share financial information freely. And my alarm bells, the ones Grandma Evelyn had installed in my brain years ago, were playing a full symphony now. Something was off. Way off. This wasn't normal mother-in-law behavior. This was reconnaissance. Margaret was gathering intelligence, and I had no idea what she planned to do with it, but every instinct I had was screaming that it wasn't going to be good. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, doing that thing where you're cooking pasta and simultaneously trying to respond to work emails on your phone like some kind of dysfunctional multitasking circus act. I saw the name, Hayes Property Management, pop up on my screen and nearly dropped my phone into the boiling water because Mr. Hayes never called me. Our arrangement was simple and beautifully hands-off. He managed Grandma Evelyn's properties, collected rent from the tenants, handled maintenance issues, and deposited my share into a separate bank account I'd set up specifically for the inheritance money. Once a quarter, he'd send a detailed report via email, and that was it. No calls, no drama, no reason for him to ever contact me directly unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. I answered with probably more panic in my voice than was professional. "Mr. Hayes? Is everything okay? Did something happen to one of the properties?" I was already imagining fires, floods, tenants who'd decided to start an illegal gambling ring in my downtown Seattle real estate. No, nothing like that, Mr. Reed," he said in that calm, measured voice that property managers must learn in some kind of special school for people who deal with landlord emergencies. "The properties are fine, but I'm calling because something unusual happened today that I thought you should know about immediately." The way he said unusual made my stomach drop like I was on a roller coaster designed by someone who hated happiness. "Someone came to my office this afternoon asking questions about the properties on Belltown Avenue," he continued, and I could hear papers rustling in the background like he was checking notes. Specifically, they wanted to know about the ownership documents, who holds the titles, whether there are any liens or mortgages, the rental income generated, and the current market valuation. They were very thorough, very professional. I turned off the stove because I was no longer capable of cooking and processing this information simultaneously. Who was it? Did they say why they wanted to know? They presented credentials identifying themselves as a private investigator, Mr. Hayes said, and those 4 words, private investigator, hit me like a freight train made of red flags and bad decisions. They claimed they were doing background research for a financial planning client, said it was routine asset verification. I, of course, told them that I couldn't disclose any information about property ownership without written authorization from the owner, which would be you. They weren't happy about it, but they left. I documented everything, took down their information. Their card said Precision Research Services. I stood there in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, watching my pasta water slowly stop boiling, and felt this cold realization settle over me like someone had dumped ice water down my shirt. There was no way this was a coincidence. Nobody randomly investigates someone's property holdings. Nobody hires a private investigator to look into a regular software engineer who drives a used Toyota and lives in a rental apartment unless they have a very specific reason to believe there's something worth investigating. Mr. Hayes, I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady even though my brain was spiraling through about 15 different worst-case scenarios. Thank you for not telling them anything. Seriously, can you send me everything you have on this person? The card, any notes from the conversation, anything they said? Already scanned and in your email, sir. I sent it before I called. God bless Mr. Hayes and his efficient, paranoid professionalism. Should I be concerned about this? Do you want me to increase security protocols or alert the tenants? No, nothing like that. Just, if anyone else comes asking questions, don't tell them anything and let me know immediately. We said our goodbyes and I hung up, standing there in my kitchen with burnt pasta and a growing sense of dread that felt like it was physically sitting on my chest. I didn't need Sherlock Holmes to figure out who was behind this. Margaret's increasingly invasive questions about my finances, her comments about wanting to make sure Clara married someone financially stable, the way she'd specifically asked about what my parents had left me. It all clicked into place with the kind of clarity that makes you feel stupid for not seeing it sooner. They'd hired someone to investigate me. My own in-laws had literally hired a spy to dig into my financial life because apparently asking invasive questions at dinner wasn't thorough enough. The next day, I caught Clara in my home office, the second bedroom we'd converted into a workspace, supposedly looking for stamps. Stamps. In my office, where I keep financial documents and absolutely zero stamps, because who the hell uses stamps anymore except for wedding invitations and angry letters to politicians? My manila folder of financial documents, the one I kept in my desk drawer, was sitting on the desk, not in the drawer where I'd left it. On the desk, slightly open. She jumped when I walked in, actually physically jumped like I'd caught her doing something she knew was wrong. Oh, hey, I needed to mail something and thought you might have stamps in here. I looked at the folder, looked at her, looked back at the folder. In my financial documents drawer? I didn't know what was in there. I was just looking through drawers. But her face was red, and she wouldn't meet my eyes, and I realized with this sinking feeling that this wasn't just Margaret going rogue. Clara knew. Clara was in on it. That night, after Clara went to bed early claiming a headache that was either real or a convenient excuse to avoid conversation, I sat in the dark living room of our embarrassing rental and whispered to the ceiling, "Grandma, if you're listening, I think the vultures have started circling." One evening, I walked into our apartment expecting the usual, maybe some takeout, Netflix, the kind of boring domestic bliss that marriage is actually made of, and instead found myself walking into what can only be described as a financial intervention staged by people who had absolutely no right to intervene. Clara, Margaret, Henry, and some random woman I'd never seen before were sitting around our dining table like it was a corporate board meeting. The table was covered with papers, official-looking documents spread out like evidence at a crime scene, except I was apparently both the criminal and the victim in this scenario. "Oliver, honey," Clara said with a smile so forced it looked painful. "Mom and Dad brought someone to help us with financial planning." Financial planning. Right. Because that's something you definitely spring on your spouse without warning, with your parents present, in your own home that suddenly doesn't feel like your home anymore. Margaret was practically glowing with predatory satisfaction, looking like a shark that had just spotted a particularly delicious seal. "This is Ms. Jenkins, our family notary. We thought we'd help you two merge your assets. It's what modern couples do, you know. Very practical." I scanned the papers spread across the table, my brain processing the words even as my blood pressure skyrocketed to levels that probably required medical attention. Joint account forms. Property transfer deeds. Something labeled family loan agreement. That made absolutely no sense because nobody had loaned anybody anything. One line jumped out at me. Turner Holdings may access funds for investment purposes. Turner Holdings. Not Oliver and Clara. Turner Holdings. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because it was either laugh or start screaming, and screaming seemed like it would make me look like the unreasonable one in this completely insane situation. Then Margaret dropped the bomb with the casual confidence of someone who thought they were holding all the cards and didn't realize they were actually holding a hand grenade with the pin already pulled. "And of course, we'll need to discuss the 3 estates in Belltown," she said, smoothing down papers like she was organizing a grocery list instead of attempting what I'm pretty sure qualified as financial coercion. It's important that Clara has security, and these properties would be perfect assets to include in the family portfolio. I froze. Completely froze. Every muscle in my body just stopped working like someone had hit the pause button on my entire existence. The 3 estates. She said the 3 estates. The ones I'd never mentioned to anyone except Mr. Hayes and my lawyer. The inheritance I'd kept quiet about specifically to avoid this exact situation. This exact nightmare scenario that was apparently happening in my living room on a random Thursday evening. I looked at Clara, desperately hoping to see surprise or confusion on her face, some indication that she was just as blindsided by this information as she should have been. But she was staring at her lap like it contained the secrets of the universe, picking at her nail polish with the kind of focused intensity people use when they're trying very hard not to make eye contact. She knew. She'd known, probably for a while now, and she hadn't said a word. "How do you know about that?" I asked, and I was genuinely impressed that my voice came out calm and measured instead of the primal scream that was happening internally. Henry leaned back in his chair with this smug expression that made me want to throw something heavy at his face. "We had you investigated, son. Just standard due diligence, making sure our daughter married someone who was financially stable and not hiding any debts or problems. Nothing personal, just good business sense." "You mean you hired a spy?" I said flatly. "That's one way to say welcome to the family. Real warm. Really builds trust." Before Henry could respond with what was probably going to be another business metaphor that completely missed the point of human relationships, I pulled out my phone and texted my lawyer, Ms. Laurel Bennett. "Emergency. Bring Evelyn's will. Now. Address attached." While Margaret and Henry started discussing how I could gift one of the estates to Clara as security for the marriage and a gesture of good faith, like I was some kind of medieval lord negotiating a dowry, Laurel arrived at my apartment like divine justice, wearing a tailored suit and carrying a briefcase that probably cost more than their notary's monthly salary. Laurel Bennett walked into my apartment 27 minutes after I sent that text, which meant she'd probably broken several traffic laws getting here, and I'd never been more grateful for a lawyer with a lead foot and a sense of dramatic timing. She took one look at the scene, the papers spread across my dining table, Margaret and Henry sitting there like they owned the place, Miss Jenkins the notary looking increasingly uncomfortable, and Clara still studying her nail polish like it was about to be on the final exam. And I watched this expression cross her face that was equal parts professional disgust and barely contained rage. Financial coercion," Laurel said brightly, setting her briefcase down with a decisive thunk that made everyone jump. "My favorite dinner topic. Right up there with tax fraud and elder abuse." Henry jumped to his feet like someone had electrocuted his chair, puffing up his chest in that way men do when they're about to say something they think is authoritative but is actually just loud. "Now wait just a minute. This is a private family discussion, and I don't know who you think you are barging in here." "Laurel Bennett, estate attorney," she interrupted smoothly, pulling out a business card and handing it to him with a smile that could freeze vodka. "And this stopped being a family discussion the moment you brought a notary and started drafting property transfer documents without the property owner's knowledge or consent. That's called fraud. Well, attempted fraud. You haven't actually succeeded yet, which is the only reason I'm not on the phone with the police right now." Margaret's face went through several shades of red before settling on something that matched her lipstick. "We're trying to help these young people organize their finances properly. Clara is our daughter, and we have every right to be concerned about her financial security. Concerned is calling and offering advice," Laurel said, opening her briefcase and pulling out a thick folder that I recognized as Grandma Evelyn's will and estate documents. "This is predatory. There's a difference, though I understand the line might be blurry when you're standing on the wrong side of it." She laid out Grandma Evelyn's will on the table, right on top of their ridiculous family loan agreement, and I watched Margaret's eyes skim the pages with increasing panic. Laurel had highlighted the relevant sections, probably in the car on the way over, because she was that kind of extra prepared that I absolutely loved in this moment, and she tapped one paragraph with her perfectly manicured nail. "Mrs. Reed's will explicitly states that the inherited properties are protected assets, held in an irrevocable trust with Mr. Oliver Reed as the sole beneficiary. They cannot be claimed as marital assets under Washington state law. cannot be transferred without Mr. Reed's explicit written consent executed in the presence of an independent legal counsel. That's me, hi. And any attempt to coerce, manipulate, or fraudulently obtain these assets constitutes grounds for legal action. She looked up at Margaret and Henry with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Any questions? I can use smaller words if needed. Ms. Jenkins, the notary who'd been sitting there looking like she desperately wished she'd called in sick today, started gathering her papers with shaking hands. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was told this was a consensual asset organization meeting. If there's any question of coercion, I can't be involved in this. I have a license to protect. Smart woman, Laurel said. You should leave. Now. Then Laurel turned to Margaret, and her voice dropped about 10 degrees. Also, hiring a private investigator to research someone's financial assets under false pretenses? That's a violation of privacy laws in Washington state. The investigator claimed to be doing routine financial verification, but what you actually did was conduct surveillance on a private citizen to gather information for the purpose of financial exploitation. That's illegal. Like, call the Bar Association illegal. Margaret went pale, the kind of pale that happens when you realize you've miscalculated badly and the consequences are about to be expensive. Clara started crying. These quiet tears that might have moved me a week ago, but now just made me feel tired and sad and incredibly stupid for not seeing this coming from miles away. I finally spoke, my voice coming out quieter than I expected, but steady. Clara, if your parents wanted a son-in-law they could control, they should have just adopted one. Would have been cheaper and less morally questionable. Henry, desperately trying to regain some ground, barked out. She's entitled to half of everything. We'll see you in divorce court, and Washington is a community property state. Laurel actually laughed. This delighted sound like Henry had just told the best joke she'd heard all year. Oh, that's adorable. You think you understand marital property law. Let me educate you. In Washington state, property acquired before marriage remains separate property. Mr. Reed inherited these estates 6 months before the wedding. Community property applies to assets acquired during the marriage. They've been married for, she checked her watch like she was timing a race, 8 days. 8 days. You know what Clara's entitled to? Half the groceries they bought this week, and maybe some wedding gifts if Oliver's feeling generous. That's it. That's the whole list. Henry's face went from red to purple, a color I didn't know human skin could achieve outside of medical emergencies. This isn't over. We'll fight this. With what? Laurel asked, packing up her briefcase with the efficient movements of someone who'd just won and knew it. You hired an investigator illegally, attempted to coerce property transfer through deception, and brought a notary to witness what amounts to financial abuse. I have documentation of all of it. Please, try to fight this. I would love the billable hours. The room went silent except for Clara's crying and the sound of my heart pounding so loud I was surprised nobody else could hear it. The divorce was quick, efficient, and deeply therapeutic in ways I didn't expect. Clara didn't contest anything, probably because her lawyer, a guy named Richard who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else, took one look at Laurel's documentation and told the Turners in very diplomatic terms that they had absolutely no case, and pursuing this further would be like setting money on fire, except less entertaining and more publicly humiliating. Washington state has this thing called a simplified dissolution process for marriages under a certain length with no kids and no shared property, and we qualified for it so perfectly it was almost funny. 8 days of marriage, and we were speedrunning a divorce like it was some kind of depressing video game category. The paperwork took longer than the actual marriage had lasted, which felt like some kind of cosmic joke that Grandma Evelyn would have appreciated. I signed documents in Laurel's office while she made dry comments about how this was technically the fastest client turnaround she'd ever had, and maybe she should start specializing in buyer's remorse matrimonial dissolution. Clara signed her copies at her parents' house, probably surrounded by Margaret and Henry trying to figure out how their foolproof plan had imploded so spectacularly. I didn't attend that signing. Didn't want to. Didn't need the closure or the confrontation or whatever people think you're supposed to get from face-to-face meetings with people who tried to financially manipulate you. The whole thing was finalized 6 weeks after that disastrous dinner party ambush. 6 weeks. I'd dated people longer than my marriage lasted, which was either hilarious or depressing depending on what time of day you asked me and how much coffee I'd had. When the judge signed off on the final decree, I walked out of the courthouse into one of those perfect Seattle days where the sun is actually shining and you can see the mountains and everything feels possible. And I just stood there for a minute breathing and feeling lighter than I had in months. I moved into one of the inherited estates the following week. The tenants had just moved out. Good timing, neutral karma, whatever you want to call it. And suddenly I was living in this absolutely gorgeous apartment in downtown Belltown with floor-to-ceiling windows, actual granite countertops, and a view of the Seattle skyline that looked like someone had photoshopped it for a real estate magazine. Every morning I'd wake up, make coffee in a kitchen that was bigger than my old apartment's entire living room, and open those curtains to that ridiculous view, and I'd whisper, "Nice try, Margaret." It became my morning ritual, my tiny act of petty satisfaction that probably wasn't emotionally healthy, but felt absolutely necessary for my mental well-being. The apartment still had that new chapter energy, that feeling of starting over in a space that had no memories of Clara or her family or any of the disaster that had been my brief attempt at marriage. I furnished it slowly, deliberately, buying things I actually liked instead of things that were practical or couple appropriate, or whatever nonsense I'd convinced myself mattered before. I got a ridiculous leather couch that was way too expensive and perfectly comfortable. I hung art that I'd always wanted but thought was too weird or too bold or too something. I set up my home office in the second bedroom with a view that made work meetings actually enjoyable because I could stare at the Space Needle while pretending to pay attention to status updates. About 3 months after everything was finalized, I was having coffee with Logan, my best man, the guy who'd cried through my entire wedding to a woman I'd been married to for roughly the same amount of time as a decent vacation. And he told me something that made me laugh so hard I nearly spit espresso across the table. Apparently, Clara had been talking to mutual friends, and word had gotten back to Logan through the complex social grapevine that exists in every friend group. The Turners had tried the same scheme before. Not the exact same details, but the same basic con. Margaret and Henry had been doing this thing where they'd target potential sons-in-law who seemed like they might have family money or inheritances, do their investigations, and then swoop in after the wedding with their financial planning routine. Clara's previous boyfriend, some guy named Derek who worked in finance and apparently had family money from old East Coast wealth, had been their target about 2 years before I came into the picture. They'd done the whole thing. The invasive questions, the private investigator, the surprise financial planning intervention. But Derek had seen it coming because apparently when you grow up actually wealthy, you develop a sixth sense for people trying to get access to your money. He'd broken up with Clara before they even got engaged, told her flat out that her parents were toxic, and he wasn't interested in marrying into a family that viewed relationships as business opportunities. Clara had been devastated, or so the story went, and Margaret and Henry had spent the next year being more subtle, more careful, waiting for the next potential mark. That mark had been me, and I'd almost fallen for it because I'd been so focused on hiding my own inheritance that I hadn't seen them hunting for it. The irony was so thick you could have served it as dessert. I'd been trying to follow Grandma Evelyn's advice about keeping my money quiet, and they'd been specifically looking for guys who were keeping money quiet because that meant there was money to find. We'd been playing completely different games on the same board, and neither of us had fully understood what the other was doing until it all exploded in my living room with Laurel Bennett as referee. I almost felt bad for Clara, caught between her genuinely predatory parents and whatever actual feelings she might have had for me that got buried under their schemes and expectations. Almost. But then I remembered her going through my desk drawers looking for financial documents and pretending to search for stamps like I was an idiot who wouldn't notice, and the sympathy evaporated pretty quickly. She'd made her choice. She'd chosen her parents' plan over being honest with me, and that was something I couldn't forgive or forget or rationalize away with generous interpretations of her character. Now I run the Evelyn Foundation, a nonprofit I started with some of the rental income from the estates. We teach financial literacy to young people, everything from basic budgeting to understanding investments to recognizing financial abuse and manipulation in relationships. The irony of me teaching people to spot gold diggers when I'd married one isn't lost on me, but that's kind of the point. I bring in speakers who talk about protecting assets, setting boundaries with family about money, understanding prenups and estate planning. We have workshops about recognizing red flags in relationships, And I always include a section about people who are weirdly interested in your financial situation, because that's information I wish someone had sat me down and explained before I proposed to a woman whose parents were literally planning to rob me. Sometimes, usually on Sundays when I'm feeling contemplative or have had too much coffee, I drive out to the cemetery where Grandma Evelyn is buried. I bring fresh lilies, because those were her favorite, the kind that smell like they're trying too hard, but in a good way. I sit on the bench next to her headstone. Yes, there's a bench, because even in death Evelyn was practical and knew people would want somewhere to sit and talk to her, and I tell her everything. I tell her about the foundation, about the people we've helped, about the guy last week who almost signed over his entire savings account to his girlfriend's investment opportunity, until our workshop made him realize it was a scam. And then I tell her about Margaret and Henry and Clara, about the whole ridiculous disaster. And I swear I can feel her laughing, that dry chuckle she used to do when someone proved her point without realizing it. You were right again, Grandma, I say, usually while adjusting the flowers or pulling weeds that have dared to grow near her plot. Money doesn't change people. It reveals who they really are. You told me that, 15 years ago? And I thought you were being paranoid and dramatic. Turns out you were just being observant and honest, which is basically the same thing when you're talking about human nature. I tell her about the estates, about how I'm living in one, and it's beautiful, and every time I walk through the door, I'm grateful she was smart enough to protect them in that trust. I tell her about the foundation and how we named it after her, and how her 3 commandments are basically the curriculum. Never lend money to Friday people. Never buy glowing talking things after midnight. Never tell people your net worth, especially people who call you babe. We've printed them on posters. Kids take photos of them for their Instagram stories. Grandma Evelyn's wisdom has gone viral in a very local, very specific way. Then I wink at the sky. Doesn't matter if it's sunny or cloudy. The wink is mandatory. And I add, and thanks for the estates, Grandma. They make great breakup recovery homes. The view really helps with the healing process. Also, the kitchen is big enough that I can cook without bumping into my own bad decisions, which is more metaphorical than I intended, but I'm going with it. I like to think she's up there somewhere, probably running Heaven's accounting department and auditing angels for unnecessary expenditures on cloud maintenance, shaking her head at how long it took me to learn what she'd been trying to teach me all along. But she's also probably proud, in that gruff Evelyn way, that I finally figured it out, that I protected what she left me, that I'm using it to help other people avoid the same mistakes. As I walk back to my car, I pull out my phone and check the foundation's email. There's a message from a college kid asking about our next workshop on recognizing financial manipulation in family relationships. I smile and type back a response, thinking about how Grandma Evelyn's legacy isn't just the real estate or the money. It's the wisdom, the warnings, the hard-earned knowledge about human nature and money, and the dangerous place where those two things intersect. Margaret and Henry are still out there somewhere, probably targeting some other unsuspecting guy who seems like he might have hidden assets. Clara's apparently dating someone new. According to social media, I definitely don't check regularly and certainly didn't look at last Tuesday. They're all still playing their games, still running their schemes, still convinced that money is the most important thing in any relationship. But me? I'm sitting in an apartment I actually own, running a foundation that's actually helping people, living a life that Grandma Evelyn would actually approve of. And every morning when I open those curtains and see that skyline, I remember what she taught me. The best revenge isn't getting even, it's living well. And maybe teaching other people how to live well too, so they don't end up divorced after 8 days because they ignored every red flag that came decorated with pearls and passive-aggressive comments about rental properties. Thanks, Grandma, for everything, but especially for being right, especially when I didn't want to hear it.